Welcome to the College Football Debrief on the CFB on OSG with your host, the Online Sports Guys.
From the college football capital of the world, Atlanta, GA, inside the padded room. It's been a while since we've been in here, but we're coming from the padded room. Welcome to the College Football Debrief. John Wilkerson here with you, and across the way from me is, from Fox Sports South, a guy that grew up in the shadow of the horseshoe at Ohio State, Corey McCartney. Thanks, Corey, for joining us.
Absolutely. How you doing?
Yeah, Corey is a friend of the show, frequent contributor, and we've got to get you on the payroll.
I'll always take more money.
All right, so as we said last week, we're beginning a series of podcasts on college football programs that were considered blue blood programs, but kind of has fallen on hard times. And we're beginning this with the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a team coming off back-to-back 4-8 seasons, and we'll get into that more in a little later. But Corey, where do you think it all went wrong for Nebraska? What do you think the genesis of the downfall of Nebraska football was?
The Bill Callahan years?
I was going to say there.
That seems like that was the time period. I mean, I would imagine it's got to be kind of tough to be a Cornhusker fan and see what Frank Solich has been able to establish at OU, at Ohio University, and be a consistent force in the MAC there, and know that this is a guy that we kind of cut bait on and didn't believe that he was the right man to follow in the obviously gigantic shadow of Tom Osborne. But I think, remember when Callahan said, okay, well, we're going to run this more like a pro style offense, and it just didn't work out for them. Who's the quarter? I'm trying to remember. I talked to the guy on the phone back in the days when I was at SI. They had the quarterback that transferred there, and things kind of fizzled for him. It would have been in his first season.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank too.
Oh, yeah, what was that quarterback's name? But he had like a bunch of tattoos all over his arms, and
oh yes,
what was that guy's name?
You have the one computer in the padded room because I left my phone somewhere else. We're handicapped here.
Yeah, there you go. So it wasn't Jordan Adams. Maybe it was the year after that. But they had this guy come in, and it was supposed to be like a big time, get for them. And I just think it was kind of a failed experiment from the start, or at least it kind of felt like it. With Zach Taylor.
That's right.
So Zach Taylor transferred in there, and things fell apart. They were just in a bad way for a while. I think Pelini was an interesting get for them. I remember talking to him when he was on Les Miles' staff at LSU and was pulling double duty, trying to get his feet on the ground in Nebraska while they were playing for a national championship in 2007. I liked the idea of Mike Riley. It felt like an interesting. This is a guy who is established. This doesn't feel like a guy who's going to get them to a certain level and move on to something else. Obviously, that failed too. Scott Frost to me is going to be really interesting. The first year, as you mentioned, 4-8 for the back-to-back seasons. The energy is undeniable with him, but are the results going to meet these expectations of a guy coming back to his alma mater?
A couple of observations for me, because when Tom Osborne retired and Frank Solich took over, running for Congress was kind of on his radar screen at the time, with an election that he won. He served, I think, 4 or 5 terms in Congress. So he wasn't around. He was in Washington. Now you had a new administration come in and made the decision on Frank Solich. And when Tom Osborne got back involved, as I recall, it was during the Callahan years, is when he came back as athletic director. He was there to rewrite the ship, and it was. They brought in Bo Pelini. We thought, and he had a pretty serviceable years at Nebraska, but toward the end it got ugly, and that's when Mike Riley came in. And I'm kind of with you with Mike Riley. I thought it was an interesting hire, and I thought it was a comfortable hire, but it just didn't work out. 2 years ago, they finished 4-8 in Riley's last year, and it felt absolutely awful in Lincoln. Last year, they finished 4-8, Scott Frost's first year, but this 4-8 feels entirely different than the 2017 4-8. I guess when you win 4 your last 6 and show some heartbeat, Yeah, you have good feeling. You got good momentum heading into 2019.
Yeah, they took Ohio State to the brink. That game that they lost 36-31 in Columbus.
Right.
They beat Michigan State.
Right.
And obviously they put up some big time points a couple times. They had a couple 50-point games last season.
Close one with Iowa.
Adrian Martinez had a lot of people really excited about the potential of stuff there. We saw what Frost was able to do at UCF, and they were still a really good team after he left last season. And there's a style to his play, and I think it updates Nebraska and gets them on the same page with everybody else. And it's nice to see them catching up with a lot of other programs.
They brought a favorite son in, probably the modern version of Tom Osborne, wouldn't you say?
Oh, there you go.
Does the formula still work? Because remember when Osborne had his success, he kept the in-state guys, interior line guys, and was pretty successful in that. And he gets skill players from New Jersey, from parts all over the country. Does Scott Frost follow that same mantra, and is it still successful?
I think at this point you don't necessarily have to do that. I think we're to the point where you can recruit nationwide now. I mean, I think when you think about, every team being on television, it completely changes, the complexity of what you have to do. I mean, certainly he got a lot of in-state recruits, in this last recruiting class as well. But, he's got guys from Arizona, he's got guys from New Jersey, Nashville, here in Georgia, he's all over the place. And I think it just kind of speaks to, with these showcases and with the way that, the recruiting is reached to where it's reached in 2019.
Right.
You don't
it's a different
have to,
animal.
Yeah, you don't have to go, but you're always going to have those, those interior guys. I think that's kind of the bread and butter for these programs, is keeping those guys in state. But yeah, I firmly expect Frost, having been in Florida and understanding the recruiting in the South, that he's going to be all over the place.
Of course, Scott Frost took over last year, 4-8 last year. You mentioned Adrian Martinez. You've got to have a dynamic, talented quarterback to be successful in college football these days. They have it.
Oh, without question. And this is a kind of guy that, this is the piece that you need, in 2019. The guy that can run, the guy that can throw. I mean, his 64% completion rate last year, 2,600 yards. You want to see the INTs drop a little bit. Threw 8 of them along with his 17 TDs last year. But the guy can run 600 plus yards. Had 140 attempts. I firmly expect that we're going to see, this guy challenged to get to close to 1,000 yards in the ground this season. I think that's a realistic thing for them. But that completion percentage has got to tick up. But he's a really, really great talent.
Obviously he's got the makeup, the build of a quarterback that can take some punishment. But still, you got to be able to limit that.
Yep.
I mean, you always bring up the Eric Dungey comparison as far as being a durable quarterback, because Eric Dungey was one of the most talented quarterbacks I've seen out there in college football. He couldn't stay healthy past mid-October, because he's just getting beat up. Adrian Martinez has the body that can withstand some of that punishment, but still, you'd like to limit that.
You would. You look at the numbers as the season went on, as he became more comfortable. You saw him, picking his spots a little bit more. I mean, the guy ran for 117 yards and 15 attempts in the last game of the season to go in with 187 on the ground. So, sometimes you equate that stuff when a guy's in a new offense. How much are they running? How much is that just play breaking down and just not truly having that grip on the playbook, to just being, kind of freewheeling a little bit? But this is a big kid. I mean, this is, the guy's 6'2", 220. I mean, he's got a strong body to him. It'll be interesting early in the season, when you've got a schedule where you open against South Alabama and you've got Northern Illinois within those first 4 games as well, and an Illinois team that's it's Illinois. That's really what you can say about them at this point in time. Things don't really heat up until late September for them. So how much do they back off a little bit and try to make him stay a little bit more in the pocket and work on, his touch on throws, as opposed to getting out in running lanes early on.
Schedule analysis is coming up a little later. Corey just gave us a little head start there.
There you go. Just a preview.
Now, but the thing about it is, Nebraska still has those complementary pieces out there for Adrian Martinez. And it's Nebraska. They're going to have running backs. And Scott Frost is getting back to that, which is good to see. I think a big addition for them is Dedrick Mills, the former Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket, who had a huge JUCO season last year. I think he could be an instant star for Scott Frost once he gets familiar with that offense.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And this is the guy who was a JUCO All-American last season. You know the ability of him, to get out and just to be that hardline runner.
And he can punish you too.
Yeah, he can. 771 yards, 12 TDs. In 2016, that was that was the leader among all Georgia Tech teams. Remember that bowl win over Kentucky, 169 yards in that one. You saw that. Saw that season and thought, okay, this guy next year, this guy's gonna blow up.
Light up the ACC.
Yeah,
it just didn't happen.
Nope, just didn't happen. And obviously there was the being suspended and had the issues off the field in his past, but I think this is a really good fit for them and a nice compliment to Martinez too when you think about a guy that can be a punishing runner.
And then defensively, it's the Black Shirts. This is a team that had some issues defensively, allowed a lot of points. It's a point of emphasis, I'm sure, this year, but there's some nice parts to that defense.
There are. Last year, they were 25th in total offense and 94th in total defense. So that was clearly, the biggest piece for them was getting around that, and being being a little bit more of a complete team. So I think that's the one thing you're going to have to see from them is being able to back up that offense with some better defensive plays. There are some some decent pieces in there. Guys like Muhammad Berry had 112 tackles last season. So they have talent there. It's just you got to get a defense to catch up with the offense when you're playing with those kind of numbers.
And they have a nice little addition too. Transfer Darian Daniels from Oklahoma State at nose guard. He's going to be. They haven't really had a guy that can plug the middle like that and stop the run, or at least stop the wave of the run. And they may have that in Daniels. Yeah,
they just you've got to be able to control the line of scrimmage without question. And in that division, when we'll get into the schedule a little bit more. I always wonder, when you have an offense like that can be so explosive, how can you take the pressure off of them best? Control that line of scrimmage and try to limit, what that other team's getting done when they've got the ball. They didn't do that last year, and some of the games the best they looked was against Ohio State. I think you can say even in take the entirety of their season, to lose to 5 points to a team that a lot of people thought should have been playing playing for a national championship. You got to be able to limit that other team. They were able to do that at spurts, but can they do that consistently is going to be a big test for them in 2019.
One thing is for sure, the fan base in Nebraska is one of the most solid out there, and they travel well, and they will go and follow the Huskers to whatever bowl game they go to, or wherever they're playing in the Big Ten or outside the conference. This is a great fan base, and getting tickets to a Nebraska game still impossible, but can be done, right?
Yeah, you know the right people.
That's right. If you know the right people, and some of the right people just might be at SeatGiant.com. That's right, SeatGiant.com. Type in SDH on your order when you check out. It helps you and it helps us. That's SeatGiant.com. When we come back, we'll be joined by Lars Anderson, a 20-year veteran of Sports Illustrated and an author. He's also a native Nebraskan, and he'll give us the scoop on the Cornhuskers next, as the College Football Debrief continues after this.
Hey, what's going on, y'all? This is Rock at the What's Up Falcons podcast, and I'm joined with my boys. My boys in the house. Where you at?
Yeah. What up?
Oh, gee, and we have Q, and we have Hoop in the house.
Q's here, the most beloved guy in all of sports entertainment.
Indeed. Hey, y'all, we want to thank everyone for listening to us, and if you want to listen to some great Falcons information, check us out on the What's Up Falcons podcast. Right, fellas?
Right. Sir. Hey, we here every week, baby.
We keeping it real, so check us out there on Twitter. Holla. Peace.
Subscribe to the What's Up Falcons podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud.
Listen to the What's Up Falcons podcast at whatsupfalcons.com.
The OSG Sports app is up and running on your Android or iPhone. All you got to do, install the OSG Sports app and listen to our podcast from college football, soccer, lacrosse. Maybe I can get John to do a CFL podcast. What are you waiting for? Let's get this done. Get the OSG Sports app today.
Welcome back. We welcome Lars Anderson to the College Football Debrief. He's an author. He's got 10 books on the shelf. 20-year veteran of Sports Illustrated. Now a journalism professor at Alabama. But most importantly, as we talk about Nebraska, he's from the great state of Nebraska and bleeds Cornhusker red. Lars, we appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
We're talking about Nebraska's recovery from hard times, and now it looks like they could be a perennial favorite in the Big Ten West this year. Let's go back to some series of events that may have led to the brief decline in Nebraska football. Where do you think that all started?
Man, you can go back to when Tom Osborne retired following the 1997 season, in which he won his third national championship in 4 years. That 97 season, Nebraska split it with Michigan, but for years in advance, the heir apparent, the handpicked heir apparent, was Frank Solich, who had been on Osborne's staff for about 20 years and had played fullback at Nebraska, and so Solich takes over. And he gets Nebraska to a national championship game. I believe it was in 2001 or 2, right in there. Nebraska got beat in the BCS title game by Miami pretty handily. Mm-hmm. And then Solich just kept racking up record, winning about 9 games a year. And after he won 9 games in a season, he was fired. It was a very controversial fire at the time, wasn't popular in Nebraska. And the athletic director, Steve Peterson, at the time decided to bring in Bill Callahan, and who was not familiar with the Nebraska culture. He's a former head coach of the Oakland Raiders, and he installed a West Coast type of offense. And Nebraska had not recruited to that type of offense. Nebraska, under Osborne and Solich, had been high formation, power run, and really the pass complemented the run. And so this radical makeover, it in retrospect, it set the program back at least a decade, and it didn't work. Callahan was never able to land a marquee quarterback who could make it work, and Nebraska lost its identity, lost its way. They started recruiting different types of offensive linemen. They did away with the walk-on program, which had always been so important to Nebraska's success, because you look at their recruiting base, and yes, Nebraska can go into Texas. They can go out to California. They've gotten great players from New Jersey in the past. But, you do a 500-mile radius or 600-mile radius, and that's really where most of your guys are going to come from. And there's just not elite talent there. And so to compensate for that, Nebraska had built up this walk-on program just specifically geared for offensive linemen. And what they would do is they'd redshirt the walk-ons, and they would put them in the weight room for 4 years. And so in often cases, they would just start 1 year, their 5th-year redshirt, where they're 23-year-old grown men, often going against 18, 19-year-old defensive linemen. And it always gave Nebraska a big advantage in the running game. And so that was all just scrapped. Callahan didn't invite Letterman back, past icons in Nebraska football. And it just was a horror show, and it went very poorly. And then they brought in Bo Pelini, and Pelini lost the fan base when a recording of him, which he thought was a private recording, it was released after Nebraska had come back and defeated Ohio State at home. And at halftime of that game, some fans actually had booed, and Pelini was highly critical of the Nebraska fans, and he was never forgiven for that. And then he eventually, had struggles, and he really had trouble just sort of fitting into the culture of Nebraska. But he was let go, and then they brought in Mike Riley, who was a shocking hire to everybody. Riley was in his 60s, never enjoyed great success at Oregon State, and it was a real head-scratcher. And at the time, Scott Frost was the highly successful offensive coordinator at Oregon, had just led the Ducks to the national championship. He mentored Marcus Mariota to a Heisman Trophy. Their offense, which still had power running principles to it, but it was they utilized all aspects of the field. It was as much a horizontal offense as a vertical offense. But the feeling among the power brokers in the athletic department was that Scott wasn't ready yet, because he had never he'd never been a head coach before. But I know that they were close to hiring him then. Then Riley comes in, and again he's trying to employ more of a West Coast type of offense, and it just doesn't work in Nebraska. Nebraska just could not get the athletes it took to run that kind of offense. And after several seasons of even failing to reach 500, he was let go. And then that brings us to Frost. He was Nebraska's target from the very beginning because of the success he had down in Florida, and turning a team that had gone winless, and 2 years later they're undefeated. And so Frost came on, and Scott at that time, it's important to remember, he had his choice. He was Florida's number one target, could have gone to Florida, but he chose to return to Nebraska, and he was, as most college football fans know, he was the quarterback on the 97 team that last won the national championship. And so what Scott did right away was to have long conversations with Tom Osborne, who still lives in Nebraska and is very much a mentor to Scott. And they brought back the walk-on program. And it just, they're going to run Scott's offense, which is a version of the Chip Kelly offense that he ran at Oregon, but there's also going to be elements of power football in it. And when Scott arrived, he was shocked at what the players looked like. I mean, he commented several times that they did not look like college football players. They just looked like kind of guys off the street. And so they implemented a very rigorous training program, got guys looking more like college football players. And in Scott's first season last year, started slowly. I think it hurt Nebraska in that their opening game, and I forget who it was against, but it was sort of a layup win. It ended up getting canceled and never rescheduled because of lightning strikes.
It was Akron.
Yeah, it was Akron. Yeah. And I think that hurt them because that was going to be just a layup victory. And then, they go on a losing streak. But as players, we're learning Scott's system, and especially on offense. But you saw right away that true freshman quarterback Adrian Martinez was special, very special, accurate throwing the ball, dynamic runner, and Nebraska kind of peaked against Ohio State on the road. They had the Buckeyes on the ropes late in the game and ended up losing, but you saw that this team was starting to really come around, and you saw Martinez develop, and And Adrian got hurt early in the season, and because of the lack of depth at quarterback, they ended up starting a true freshman walk-on, like a kid who wasn't even offered a scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
He's 18 years old, and he is playing for Nebraska. He's starting at Nebraska.
Yep.
That shows you the lack of recruiting of the previous coach, right?
Right.
And so they had issues there. They were really small on the defensive line. They got pushed around a lot in Big Ten play, but they finished the season strong, and I think that's why you're seeing a team with a losing record last year. You're seeing some preseason polls with them in the top 15, top 20, and a big part of that is Adrian Martinez, and also Frost went out and got a bunch of really quick, sort of smallish wide receivers in the junior college ranks. They had depth issues. They had depth issues all across the board on both offense and defense, but especially at wide receiver. And so there is optimism now. And again, like Scott is one. He's a very smart guy. And he played quarterback at Nebraska, but he played defensive back in the NFL for a number of seasons. So he has a unique perspective on the offense that he wants to run because he's seen it from both sides. And he's the play caller. I mean, he targeted Adrian Martinez as his number one recruit right away. And Martinez at the time was committed to Tennessee. Scott was able to flip him, and they need to build up the offensive line. Still, they had issues on the offensive line last year, but you can see improvement. And through it all, through all these losing seasons, the one thing that Nebraska has is an incredibly loyal fan base.
Yes, they do.
The home sellout streak dates back to the 60s. There was a time in the last few years where it looked like that streak was going to be snapped because of the poor play on the field, the poor product on the field. But there is widespread optimism about where the program is going. Frost has been able to get some 4-star recruits. Nothing like Alabama, who sort of has the pick of the litter of 5 stars, or Clemson, but you see Nebraska sort of inching up there in the national recruiting rankings. And, like it or not, there is a correlation to recruiting rankings and usually ultimately how you finish in the polls 3 years later. And so, the rebuild is definitely underway, and Nebraska has a very favorable schedule. They should be 4-0 when Ohio State comes into Lincoln in early October, I believe, and Ohio State should be 4-0 as well. And that will be a real true measuring stick. I mean, Nebraska could be, right on the cusp of being a top 10 team at that point if things go according to plan and Adrian Martinez doesn't get hurt. They do have Ed McCaffrey's youngest son, who is a 4-star quarterback, as a backup, and they're really high on him. But if Martinez stays healthy, Nebraska should be 4-0 going into that Ohio State game. And to me, if both teams are 4-0, that sort of sets up, like, it could be like a college game day. It could visit Lincoln because they haven't been there for so long. And so, and again, Scott is they're taking on walk-ons. He is making sure that every kid who is in state, who he thinks is worthy of playing in Nebraska, does not get out of state, because there have been a handful of kids who've gone to Iowa, gone to Ohio State, and then gone on and play in the NFL. And these are Nebraska kids who left because they were so dissatisfied with previous coaches. And another interesting thing, and I don't know if this has ever happened before, frankly, when Scott left Florida, South Florida, or UCF, Central Florida. When he left UCF every single assistant came with him. So there was great continuity within the coaching staff. They know each other. They like each other. There's a really, really good mix of sort of younger and older guys. And so the staff knows exactly what they want, and they know the blueprint for a relatively quick turnaround. And you just look at the rest of the division that Nebraska plays in the Big Ten, and Wisconsin has question marks, Iowa has question marks. So it's really kind of there for the taking this year. It's really going to be wide open. And granted, the other side of the Big Ten is much stronger, but Nebraska does have a favorable schedule. And it wouldn't surprise me, and this is not coming from someone who is wearing Cornhusker colored glasses. It wouldn't surprise me if they won their division and ended up in the Big Ten title game against the likes of a Michigan or Ohio State.
Well, I mean, they are the sexy pick right now as we head into the talking season of college football. And you covered a lot of ground there. To me, it's what a differences between 4 and 8 seasons. You had a 4 and 8 season in 2017, and it was just a low point. You have another one last year. Yet you won 4 of the last 6, and it feels so much different when you have a fresh coaching staff coming in. It's a homegrown leader. And then my kind of observation about Scott Frost, he just strikes me to be a modern-day Tom Osborne. Very matter-of-factly demeanor. You've probably been around him a lot more than I have. Is that a good assessment?
Yeah, I have spent a lot of time with Scott. I wrote a profile on Scott when I was at Sports Illustrated, and he was a quarterback, and I'll never forget, we walked out onto the Memorial Stadium field. We walked out on the turf of Memorial Stadium, and we started throwing the football around, and he was standing at the goal line, and he was like, hey, just go. So I went from the 30 to 40 to 50, and he kept waving me. 40. I get to the 30, so I'm 70 yards away, and he just heaves it, and I ended up catching the ball at the 27. It was a 73-yard toss, and He had barely warmed up. He's got a huge arm, and to this, he gets in there. He'll get in there and mix it up with the guys. He is very matter of fact, very smart. He got into Stanford. He comes from an athletic family. His mom competed in the Olympics, in track and field, and he was a legend from tiny Wood River, Nebraska. And some people aren't over the fact that he left Nebraska to go to Stanford, but at the time Stanford was being coached by Bill Walsh, and Scott thought that Walsh was going to be this sort of he would be the coach that would get him to the NFL. But then, then Walsh ended up leaving and Scott transferred back to Nebraska. But yeah, there's huge optimism, and again, you just look at his track record as a play caller, offensive coordinator, and he absolutely loves Adrian Martinez. He likes his demeanor on the field, doesn't get too high, doesn't get too low. He can make all the throws, and he's again a dynamic runner. He needs to learn how to avoid hits, and that was an issue last year as a true freshman. And also, you have to remember that Martinez missed his entire senior year of high school with a shoulder injury, and so there was maybe a little bit of a rust factor, but Scott believes, and he'll tell you this, he believes that he is the best quarterback in the country in Adrian Martinez. And certainly, I think if he stacked him up against the other quarterbacks in the Big Ten, he's right there. You don't know what you're going to get out of Justin Fields. There's still question marks just about every other quarterback except maybe at Michigan. But everything sort of in this offense, it's so quarterback centric and making the reads, getting the ball out fast, having playmakers on the edge, but yet still wanting to utilize power running. And so it's a unique offense. Like I said, it's evolved a little from the Chip Kelly offense at Oregon, but those are the basic principles of it. And he was asked at his Big Ten media days, his first, this was last year, and he was asked, how do you think your offense is to fare against Big Ten defenses? And he's like, you got the question wrong. It's about how a Big Ten defense is going to fare with my offense. So he exudes confidence. And for a program that has been broken for the better part of 15 years, that's exactly what you need. And I mean, Scott, he's always had confidence, and that has been interpreted as arrogance in the past. But he fully believes in what he's doing, and again, I think he's getting results in recruiting. But at Nebraska, it's always been not necessarily getting the 5-star or even the 4-star. It's about turning 3 stars through player development into 4 stars. And you go back and look at their national championship teams, their average recruiting ranking was something like 32. So it really it's about development, and so and that comes down to coaching. And so we'll see, but again, there is definitely a sense of optimism. And, I'm based in Birmingham, Alabama, and even the local talk radio shows here, and I host a talk radio show here with Jay Barker, former Alabama quarterback. There is a lot of buzz about Nebraska being this sort of long shot pick to make it to the playoffs, because you can see a path where they get to the Big Ten championship game, and then that's one game. If they could somehow pull an upset over Ohio State or Michigan, they would have a pretty good argument, if they only had one loss during the year, of being one of the final 4 teams. And I don't know what the odds are in Vegas for Nebraska to even make the playoffs, but I've had friends who are pretty heavy into gambling who have laid some money on Nebraska.
Yeah, I'm not so sure yet if I'd bet the mortgage on it yet, but you're starting to convince me.
No,
Lars.
I'm not saying bet the mortgage on it, but for taking a flyer bet,
sure,
where the odds are like 400 to 1, lay down $10.
Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
And if they come through with that, you might be able to pay off your mortgage with that that simple $10 bet. We're talking with Lars Anderson, 20-year vet of Sports Illustrated. He's got 10 books out there. He's also an author, a journalism professor, as well as Alabama. And you've done a great job educating us on Nebraska, which is your home state. But I want to switch gears and talk about another team that wears red, Alabama, because you've got a book coming out soon called Chasing the Bear. Give us a little description of that.
Yeah, it's essentially a dual biography of Bear Bryant and Nick Saban. And I've been in Alabama ever since about 2005, and Saban arrived in 2007. So I've been covering Saban ever since he came to Alabama from the Miami Dolphins, and had several one-on-ones with him over the years. I have a really good relationship with him. And so I feel like I have a good sense of who he is, what makes him tick. And, through the years, I've conducted hundreds of interviews with former players, current players. And then, so what I do in the book, so I start with sort of an opening scene of Bear Bryant's funeral. And the car behind the funeral was, Bear Bryant's grandson, Mark Tyson. Mm-hmm. And that funeral, it was a procession from Tuscaloosa to Birmingham to Elmwood Cemetery here in Birmingham. About 300 cars were in the procession, and the Birmingham News estimated that over 600,000 people lined the 45-mile route along the interstate, which meant 1 out of every, I think, 8 people in Alabama actually saw the procession go by. So it was very much like state funeral here. And then I go through how Mark ended up having the grandson, had his own son, Paul Tyson. As a kid, he brought Paul to the Alabama games. Paul kept growing, met Nick Saban, kept going to games. His relationship with Saban grew. And now, to make a long story short, Paul Tyson was in Saban's last recruiting class as a 4-star quarterback out of Hewitt-Trussville here in Birmingham. So it's a way of binding the two together, because literally the DNA of Bear Bryant is on a Nick Saban team. And then from there, I start with Bear Bryant's first year, do a chapter on that. And then next chapter is Nick Saban's first year. And it's and then it just toggles back and forth. Bear Bryant builds, Nick Saban builds. Bear Bryant wins his first championship, Nick Saban wins his. And it's sort of like, how did they do it? And so you see how their coaching philosophies are similar and different, but also you see how college football has evolved throughout the years through the experiences of these two coaches who I think most would agree are the two greatest college football coaches of all time. And, it was fascinating for me, especially to go back and interview a lot of Bear Bryant's former players, and what they would describe of what they went through. It sounds just so much like what Nick Saban put his players through at the very beginning. And I really get into the details of how Saban did it, how he was able to take a team that was 6-6 in 2006, and then 3 years later, mostly with Mike Shula's players, wins a national championship. The juniors and seniors on that team he didn't recruit. Yes, he had got studs like Julio Jones, Marcel Darius, Mark Barron, Dante Hightower. That in that 2008 recruiting class, by the way, those guys collectively, as of my last count, and this was just a couple months ago, they've earned over $200 million in the NFL. And that class of 2008 was really the backbone upon which everything was built for Saban. And, Saban then reeled off number one recruiting class after number one recruiting class. So I get into what makes Saban a better recruiter than everyone else. I mean, it really can be distilled down just to preparation and hard work, but there's much more to it than that. And, how was Bear Bryant able to do it? How did he get the guys? And he played with smaller players, and it was really just toughness. It was toughness. Bryant beat the crap out of his players in practice. He wouldn't give them water breaks. He was really, really hard on them. But they also, Bear Bryant had a crossroads moment in his career, switched from a pro set formation that Joe Namath threw out of and other sort of classic quarterbacks. He switches to the wishbone, and so he adapted to the college game. What does Nick Saban do after running power? Well, the teams that he's having trouble with are running hurry up spread. So Nick Saban goes to the hurry up spread after spending a lot of time criticizing the hurry up spread. And now you see the sort of the not rebirth of Nick Saban, but just a new version of his coaching style. He both Saban and Bryant adapted and evolved. And that's why you see so many coaches, they will have like this flash of success, but they don't study where the game is heading. But Bryant and Saban were able to do that. They both won national championships with offenses that have nothing in common, with two completely separate different offenses. And so it was a fascinating book to research and write, and it will be out in early September. September 3rd is the release date, and it's already available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and all the major booksellers.
And the radio show you do, tell us about that.
Yeah, I started last August. Jay Barker and I, and Antonio Langham, who Jay was former quarterback at Alabama, still remains the winningest quarterback in Alabama history. Led Alabama to the '92 national championship. And Antonio Langham, he was also on that '92 team, a cornerback. 30 for 30. ESPN did a whole documentary on a play that he made in the inaugural SEC championship game called the Play That Changed College Football. He had a pick six against Florida, which really opened the door. It was the first conference title game that was ever played, and at the time, other conference commissioners across the country scoffed at the idea because Alabama was a shoo-in. They would have played for the national championship against Miami in the Sugar Bowl, and they were playing a Florida team that was 8-3. So Alabama had everything to lose, nothing to gain, and they're losing the game. And Antonio makes this interception, and it sort of changes everybody's thought on conference championship games. And then, I mean, you can extrapolate this. It changes everybody's notion on the college football playoff. And so, like, if you really just want to have, like, a fun bar argument, like, do we have a college football playoff today if Antonio Langham doesn't make that interception? So I do a show with those two guys, and obviously it's on all throughout Alabama. And we focus a lot on the Alabama football, probably too much for my liking, but we also talk about other subjects. It's my first foray into radio, but it's been a lot of fun for the 9 months or so that we've been doing it.
Yeah, I feel your pain. My co-host for this podcast, Anthony Goldman, I think he bleeds houndstooth. I get a lot of Alabama stuff from him, too. Lars Anderson, I appreciate your time and joining us on the College Football Debrief podcast. It's great talking to you. You gave us some great information.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I'd love to come back anytime.
All right. Corey rejoins me when we come back.
Want tickets to the big game? Go to SeatGiant.com. Use the code SDH at checkout. It helps you and it helps us. That's SeatGiant.com.
The OSG Sports app is up and running on your Android or iPhone. Install the OSG Sports app and listen to our podcast of college football, soccer, and lacrosse. What are you waiting for? Get the OSG Sports app today. We're talking Nebraska football here on the College Football Debrief. John Wilkerson, Corey McCartney from Fox Sports South. This is the first of a series of podcasts talking about blue blood programs that have reached some hard times but recovering, or in the midst of recovering. We're talking about the Nebraska Cornhuskers, obviously. Corey, that's stenciled in on the helmet. That brand still resonates nationally.
Yeah, well, I always kind of go back to being a kid and the joke that it stood for knowledge. I thought that was so great. But yeah, this is one of I know you're doing a series on blue bloods, but you think about those Osborne years, and it's this was a truly dominant team. And when I did my Heisman book, I talked to Eric Crouch, for that book, and that obviously was the brand of football. I think spoke more because you got your ballot for the College Football Hall of Fame for this year, right? And
I did.
And I had Eric Crouch. And to me, if you win a Heisman Trophy, you should be in the College Football Hall of Fame. But I know there's a lot of people that don't vote for him because he was a byproduct of that system, right? But I think that to me is Nebraska football. During that time period, it was a system that continued to deliver. I mean, Tommy Frazier took it to a completely different level, but that you knew what you're going to get each and every year from Nebraska football under Tom Osborne. You don't know what you're going to get anymore. We don't know what we have gotten for the better part of the last 20 years from Nebraska, and I think that's the big push going forward is that consistency, and can Scott Frost get them back to that level again?
I've been lucky and gotten to know Coach Osborne, and he's a very mild-mannered guy, rock solid guy, but I'm sure in the heat of battle, and I've been to a few Nebraska games when he was head coach. You can see the fire burning in him, and he did a great job of kind of suppressing that, at least outwardly. But the fire competition burned inside of Tom Osborne, and you could tell in his teams. They just quietly and unassumingly went about their business.
Oh, without question.
And won 10, 11 games a year.
Yeah, the guy was a legend.
Well, it's time to do some schedule analysis, and you kind of got a little head start there talking about their September schedule. They open with South Alabama in Lincoln. I love the fact that they're playing Colorado again. I mean, it's good to see the Nebraska-Colorado rivalry, at least back in some kind of a form or fashion, because that was one of the great college football rivalries that was budding in the late 80s and 90s. And they meet in Folsom Field this time. And I've kind of penciled that game as one of my early games that I'll be watching this year.
Colorado's picked to finish 11th in the Pac-12, so I mean it may not be. It's going to have some nostalgia to it, but I don't know that it's going to be, really the barn burner on the field. I mean that's that program is just in a bad way too. I mean went 5-7 last year. I really I don't want to dive too far into this, but I think Nebraska is really set up to have a really nice first half of the season. I think things could get really good for them. But yeah, that they should get that win at Colorado. I mean that team I think is statistically, from what they have coming back from last year, is going to be in a bad way.
And then Northern Illinois comes back to Lincoln 2 years after winning in Lincoln in 2017. That was kind of the tipping point, I guess, in the Mike Riley administration when that loss happened in Lincoln. And then Illinois in Champaign before the showdown with Ohio State. Now, obviously, that's going to be a watershed game for Nebraska this year with the Buckeyes coming in. They may be I mean, we don't know because it's going to be the fifth game of the year. We don't know how the year is going to pan out. But here we are in June, and we're speculating. So what the hell? The Ohio State team might have a different feel to it than the Urban Meyer teams in the past. I'm speaking out loud here in June.
Sure.
And this might be a winnable game for Nebraska, especially if we think what we think might happen with Nebraska coming in, let's say at 4-0 with some momentum.
I think they will be 4-0. I mean, Northern Illinois will be a tough game. That team's always tough, but they face Utah the week before they play Nebraska. So you think about a group of five team playing back-to-back, Power Fives. I mean, that's a rough go for those kids. And how can you get them up for two of those games in a row? Is both of them on the road that's going to be a tough test. But yeah, the Ohio State game. I mean, certainly, there's going to be a lot of focus on Ryan Day in year one. He's still going to have a ton of weapons. I'm sure. I would imagine Ohio State still, even if the Buckeyes have a loss at that point, I think they're still going to probably be favored going into that one. I don't see Ohio State losing a game. When you think about FAU, Cincinnati, and Notre Dame and Miami, Ohio before that game, I think they'll both be undefeated. But what a nice get for the Big Ten, though, when you think about, while outside of Wisconsin on that side of things, you've kind of waited for somebody else to kind of establish themselves. This is what they wanted when they got Nebraska, right? Was for them to be in this position. I will be stunned if September 28th it's not undefeated Nebraska versus undefeated Ohio State.
In prime time, I'm sure.
Imagine.
And what a way to welcome back Nebraska into the upper echelon of college football. Win or lose, really. I mean, this is what you and I grew up with Nebraska football. They are always in these type of games.
Is that a blackout night?
It could be a blackout
night. I think it feels like it. You think if it's at night, you get the blackout, I think that'll be a good look for Nebraska.
And here's the one thing, if you're a Nebraska fan, you're kind of worried because after you spent so much emotion in that Ohio State game, win or lose, you got Northwestern coming to Lincoln the next week. And we all know Northwestern is our program on the rise, and they've made some nice additions to their football program, personnel-wise.
They have. I think they're going to lose to Ohio State. Does that get you down enough that you lose to Northwestern that following week? Because actually that's a week break. 18 to
21-year-old boys to men.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the factor.
I mean, I look at their first, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I look at the first 9 games for them and feel like they could be 7-2. They could be 8-1. They could be 8-1 or 7-2.
I think Purdue will be tough.
Yep. Going into November, I really think this team has the potential to go into it with maybe one loss.
And that Wisconsin game probably playing for the division title.
I feel like that's
agree.
probably the case. I mean, Iowa lost a lot. Maryland is, who knows what that,
With Mike Loxley there?
Who knows? They're kind of a wild card. You saw some really great stuff from them at moments last year, but it's conceivable to me this is a 10-win Nebraska team by the end of the season.
So that would kind of complete the journey to getting that from having some struggles the last few years to being back in the upper echelon of the Big Ten. And does that office in Chicago just love the fact that Big Red would be back?
I think. Oh yeah. I mean, this is what John Swofford's winning with Florida State and Miami, right? This is what conference expansion was all about, was grabbing those blue blood programs and hoping that they get back to the point where you get return on investment.
And what I'm thinking of, and as we've talked about Nebraska Cornhuskers here, and we both agree that a 10-win season and a division title, Big Ten West title, is possible for this team. And I'm sure preseason-wise, they're going to be the sexy pick to win the Big 10 West and play for the title game in December. But I guess we're now, 10 years into the Big Ten experience with Nebraska. Was joining the Big Ten an adjustment period that wasn't anticipated as Nebraska was trying to get back into its position as being one of the top programs in college football? And are we kind of seeing the end of those growing pains now as we head into the 2019 season as far as Nebraska and the Big Ten, getting used to everything, finding new rivalries, that kind of thing?
You mentioned Osborne being back in the building there, and I can't remember, it was either Callahan or Pelini told me that when you have an office there and the guy right above you is Tom Osborne, and whenever Tom Osborne feels like he sees something on the field of play that he's not thrilled about, he comes down and talks to you about it. I sort of wonder how much that hindered them during that time period too, and his being back and maybe he's not like that with Frost, but it didn't work for the last two guys, or maybe there's just a difference because this is one of his guys.
Right.
That could be a completely different approach to things because it is one of his guys. But I think they've just it took them a while to find the right guy. Mm-hmm. To get retread. Basically, I mean, Bill Callahan was a retread.
Right.
Mike Riley was a guy that, as much as he's respected, what was he coaching for? Right. What was the next step in Mike Riley's career?
Because he had 2 terms at Oregon State.
Yeah.
Couple in between with the Chargers.
Yeah.
And he built the Oregon State program for Dennis Erickson, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And before he took the NFL job, didn't have the same kind of success at Oregon State, but Nebraska saw something in him that was a little different, a little quirky, that might have worked in Mid-America. And again, it just didn't work out there. And they brought in one of their own, as I said earlier in the show, the modern-day version of Tom Osborne. And what we've discussed, that's pretty much been a good move, and we liked our chances this year.
And then you look at Bo Pelini and that time period with him, and I really liked Amir Abdullah. I think they had a lot of fun guys on those teams, but that always to me felt like a situation where okay, I've got the defense, you guys handle the offense, and it just never felt like that. How much does that work? How often does it work in college football when the head coach is more into the defense than he is the offense?
I can't recall that kind of scenario ever working.
But it works on the offensive side. I think
it works on the offensive side, yeah, because
with Leach and Charlie Weiss and on, and you can think of guys, Kingsbury, you can think of guys where they've been more offensive minded, and it's been okay that they turn the defense over to somebody else. But when the coach is into the defense and he doesn't care as much about the offense, it never seems to be quite so. You could make the case that's something that Saban does, but I don't think that's the case now.
No.
But I can't remember the last time a coach was that was the defensive guy, and he was gonna. if you have a really great defensive coordinator, it's a different situation than if the coach is basically the de facto defensive coordinator and he detaches. And I just don't feel like it doesn't work to me when the head coach is more of a defensive figure.
That could be a good subject for another show.
There you go.
Let's put the wraps on the Nebraska Cornhuskers. We need to bring him in here. That's a good 3 hours right there of discussion. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, we've been talking about the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Corey McCartney and I both agree that double-digit wins is possible this year, and a Big Ten West championship could be in the cards, and a trip to the Big Ten title game could happen for the Cornhuskers. I'm sure they're going to be the top pick and all when the preseason polls come out in the Big Ten. Corey, it's great for you to join us, and
absolutely
enjoyed discussing Nebraska football with you. Again, this is the first of a series of podcasts on Blue Blood programs that have kind of lost their way and trying to recover. Florida State and Southern Cal are the other ones we've targeted, and look forward to those podcasts on down the road. So, for Corey McCartney, I'm John Wilkerson. Thanks for joining us. So long, everyone.